The wheelchair hit the gravel with a hollow metallic crash. Margaret's hands trembled against the cold kitchen tile as she watched through the screen door. Her husband's silhouette stood in the fading evening light, his breath heavy, his fists still clenched. The chair lay sideways in the driveway like something discarded, something worthless. She could not stand. She could not walk. And he knew that. He had always known that. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Margaret Ellen Miller was 63 years old. She had lived in the same house for nearly 4 decades. She had raised 2 children within its walls. She had buried her mother from its front porch and watched her grandchildren take their first steps across its wooden floors. This house knew her. Every creak of the floorboard, every draft from the old windows, every familiar shadow that stretched across the hallway at dusk. It was all part of her. And yet, in recent months, this same house had begun to feel like something else entirely. It had begun to feel like a cage. Margaret had not walked in 12 years. The accident had happened on a rain-slicked highway outside of Greenville, South Carolina. A truck had run a red light. Her sedan had spun twice before slamming into a guardrail. She remembered the sound of glass shattering. She remembered the smell of gasoline and wet asphalt. And she remembered waking up 3 days later in a hospital bed, unable to feel her legs. The doctors had used words like permanent and spinal damage and adjustment. But no word could describe what it truly felt like to lose the ability to stand, to walk, to move freely through the world she had known her entire life. The wheelchair had become her legs. It was not just a chair, it was her independence. It was the difference between making her own coffee and waiting for someone to bring it. It was the difference between watching the birds from the back porch and being trapped inside a bedroom with the curtains drawn. Without it, she could not reach the bathroom. She could not open the front door. She could not get to her medication, which sat on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet. Too high for her to reach from the floor, but just right when she sat in that chair, stretched her arm, and pulled the orange bottle into her palm. Without it, she was not a woman. She was a burden. That is what Harold had started calling her, though not always out loud. Sometimes it was in the way he sighed when she asked for help. Sometimes it was in the silence that followed her questions. And sometimes, on the worst nights, it was in the words he muttered under his breath when he thought she could not hear. Dead weight. Useless. What's the point? Margaret had heard every one of them. She never responded. She never cried in front of him. But late at night, when Harold's snoring filled the room and the moonlight crept through the blinds, she would lie perfectly still and wonder how much longer she could survive like this. Not physically. Physically, she had learned to endure. But emotionally, spiritually, she was not sure how much more her heart could take. The stakes were not small. If Harold continued down this road, if his resentment deepened, if his patience vanished completely, Margaret knew what could happen. She had seen stories like hers on the evening news. Elderly women found alone in neglected homes. Disabled spouses abandoned by partners who had grown tired of caregiving. She had always turned off the television when those stories came on. She told herself that would never be her. She told herself Harold was different. But now, lying on that kitchen floor with her wheelchair somewhere outside in the gravel, she was not so sure anymore. What could she lose? Everything. She could lose her ability to care for herself, the last thread of dignity she still held. She could lose access to her medication, which kept her blood pressure stable and her heart rhythm steady. She could lose her safety, her shelter, her sense of peace. She could lose the few friends who still called, the daughter who had drifted away after years of family tension, the quiet pride she carried from having survived so much already. And she could lose her life, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, in the kind of way no one notices until it is too late. A missed medication, A fall with no one to help her up. A door locked from the outside. A man who had once promised to love and protect her, deciding that she was no longer worth the effort. That was the danger Margaret faced. It was not the kind of danger that came with sirens and flashing lights. It was the kind that lived in silence, in isolation, in the slow erosion of a woman's worth by the one person who was supposed to stand by her side. And the worst part, the part that kept Margaret awake long after midnight, was that no one else could see it. To the outside world, Harold was a devoted husband, a man who had stayed, a man who had sacrificed. But Margaret knew the truth. She knew that love could turn into resentment. She knew that sacrifice could become a weapon. And she knew, deep in her bones, that if something did not change soon, she might not survive another year in this house. Not because her body would fail, but because her spirit already had. There was a time when mornings in the Miller household felt like grace. Margaret would wake before the sun fully rose, her eyes fluttering open to the soft gray light that crept through the thin cotton curtains. The bedroom was always cool in those early hours, the kind of cool that made the blankets feel like a gentle embrace. She would lie still for a moment, listening. The house would be quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the dresser and the distant call of cardinals outside the window. She had come to love those birds, their bright red bodies and sharp, clear songs. Harold used to say they were nature's alarm clock. Margaret used to smile when he said it. In those days, Harold was always the first to rise. She would hear his footsteps padding softly down the hallway, careful not to wake her. She would hear the creak of the kitchen cabinet, the quiet clink of a coffee mug being placed on the counter, and the slow gurgle of the old percolator coming to life. By the time she wheeled herself into the kitchen, the coffee would already be poured. Her favorite blue mug, the one with the small chip on the handle, would be waiting for her on the table, steam curling gently into the morning air. Harold would be sitting across from her, reading the newspaper, his glasses low on his nose. He never said much in the mornings, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. The way he folded the newspaper when she entered the room. The way he pushed her mug a little closer to the edge of the table so she could reach it easily. The way he glanced up at her just once and gave a small nod, as if to say, "Good morning, I'm glad you're here." Those were the details Margaret held on to. Those were the moments that made her believe their love was unshakable. The kitchen was always filled with light. It was a small room, nothing fancy, yellow wallpaper with tiny white flowers, a checkered tablecloth that Margaret had bought at a church rummage sale years ago, and a window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard. In the spring, the dogwood tree would bloom just beyond that window, its pale pink petals catching the breeze and sometimes drifting onto the grass like confetti. Margaret loved to sit by that window after breakfast, watching the world wake up. She would listen to the gospel station on the old radio that sat on the counter, humming along to hymns she had known since childhood. Those were holy hours, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because nothing bad did. There was peace in the ordinary. There was safety in the routine. Every morning unfolded the same way. Coffee, quiet conversation, the soft crackle of the radio, and the warmth of sunlight spreading slowly across the floor. Margaret had learned, after the accident, to treasure these small things. She had learned that joy did not always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came in a cup of coffee poured without being asked. Sometimes it came in the familiar rhythm of a life shared with someone who knew you completely. Harold had been that person for so long. He had been the one who adjusted the doorways when she came home from the hospital. He had been the one who installed the ramp on the front porch, sanding down the edges so her wheels wouldn't catch. He had been the one who rearranged the furniture in the living room so she could move freely, who lowered the shelves in the bathroom so she could reach her towels, who never once complained, at least not out loud, about the way their lives had changed. Margaret had watched him do all of it with a quiet kind of devotion, and she had loved him more deeply for it. She believed they had found their rhythm. After breakfast, Harold would go for his morning walk, a slow loop around the neighborhood that took him past the old Lutheran church, the elementary school, and back again. Margaret would spend that time reading or knitting, or simply sitting on the back porch with a second cup of coffee, letting the stillness settle into her bones. When Harold returned, they would share lunch together. In the afternoons, he worked in the garden while she watched from the window. In the evenings, they sat side by side on the couch, watching old game shows and sometimes holding hands without saying a word. It was not a glamorous life, but it was theirs. It was built on 40 years of shared meals, shared grief, shared laughter. It was built on the understanding that love was not a feeling. It was a choice made over and over again in the quiet moments no one else ever saw. Margaret had made that choice every single day. She had believed with her whole heart that Harold had made it too. And for a long time he had. But seasons change, and people, even the ones we trust most, sometimes change with them. Margaret would not see it coming, not at first. The peace was too complete, too familiar, too safe. She had grown comfortable in the warmth of their routine. She had stopped looking for cracks in the walls. And that, perhaps, was her only mistake. She was 24 years old, standing beneath a white canopy tent at the annual church picnic in Ridgewood, North Carolina. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and charcoal smoke from the barbecue grills. Children ran barefoot across the lawn, chasing one another with water balloons. Somewhere in the distance, a man played acoustic guitar while a group of women sang hymns in soft, harmonized voices. Margaret had come with her mother that day, reluctantly, wearing a pale yellow sundress and wishing she were anywhere else. She had just ended a long relationship. She was not looking for love. She was not looking for anything at all. And then she saw him. Harold was standing near the lemonade table, alone, holding a paper cup and staring at the ground as though he were trying to disappear into it. He was tall and lean, with dark hair combed neatly to one side, and a face that seemed too serious for a summer afternoon. He wore a white short-sleeved shirt buttoned all the way to the collar, and his shoes, Margaret would never forget this detail, were polished so perfectly they reflected the sunlight. He looked out of place. He looked uncomfortable. And for reasons she could not explain, Margaret found herself walking toward him. She asked if the lemonade was any good. He looked up, startled, as though no one had spoken to him in hours. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and when they met hers, something shifted in the air between them. He smiled, a small, cautious smile, and said, "It's too sweet, but I've had 3 cups already, so I suppose that says something about me." Margaret laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks, and from that moment on she knew, without logic, without reason, that this quiet, awkward man with the polished shoes would become someone important in her life. They were married 14 months later. The wedding was small, held in the same church where they had met. Margaret wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her frame. Harold cried during the vows, not loudly, but enough that his voice trembled when he said, "I do." After the ceremony, they drove to a cabin in the mountains for their honeymoon. They had little money, no grand plans, and an uncertain future ahead of them. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way Harold looked at her across the breakfast table each morning. What mattered was the way he reached for her hand in the darkness before they fell asleep. What mattered was the quiet certainty that they were building something together, something that would last. And for many years, it did. When Margaret's father was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1991, Harold drove 3 hours every Friday after work to sit with her in the hospital waiting room. He never complained. He never asked for recognition. He simply showed up, week after week, holding her hand while her father faded, and her heart broke into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. When her father passed, Harold stayed beside her at the funeral, steady as stone, catching her when her knees gave out at the graveside. That was the kind of man he was, the kind who showed up, the kind who stayed. And when the accident happened, Harold proved it again. Margaret remembered waking in that hospital bed, unable to feel her legs, unable to process what the doctors were telling her. She remembered the terror in her chest, the way the room seemed to spin and blur. But she also remembered Harold standing in the doorway, his face pale but his voice calm. He walked to her bedside, took her hand, and said, "We'll figure it out, whatever it takes." He didn't flinch. He did not look away. He simply held her hand and let her cry until there were no tears left. In the months that followed, he kept his word. He learned to lift her from the bed to the chair without hurting her back. He learned which medications needed to be taken with food and which ones made her nauseous. He learned to read her silence, to know when she needed space and when she needed comfort. He rearranged their entire home so she could move freely. He installed grab bars in the bathroom and a ramp on the front porch. He gave up golf, gave up fishing trips, gave up Friday nights at the lodge with his friends. He gave up everything that took him away from her. And Margaret loved him for it. She loved him more deeply than she had on their wedding day. She loved him for the sacrifices he never spoke of, for the patience he showed when she was frustrated, for the way he kissed her forehead each night and whispered, "You're not a burden, you're my wife." She believed those words. She carried them in her heart like prayers. And for a long time, they were enough to sustain her, enough to make her believe that no matter what life threw at them, they would face it together. But love, Margaret would learn, is not always enough. And devotion, no matter how deep, can wear thin with time. It began with a sigh. Margaret did not notice it at first. It was a Tuesday evening, sometime in late September, and the air had just begun to carry the faint chill of autumn. She was sitting in the living room, a wool blanket draped across her lap, watching the evening news while the last light of the day faded beyond the curtains. Harold was in the kitchen, washing the dishes from dinner. She could hear the water running, the soft clink of plates being stacked, and beneath it all, so quiet she almost missed it, a long, heavy sigh. It was not a sigh of tiredness. It was something else, something deeper, something that sounded almost like disappointment. Margaret turned her head toward the kitchen doorway. She waited for Harold to say something, to explain what was on his mind. But he didn't. He simply finished the dishes, dried his hands on the towel by the sink, and walked past her without a word. He sat down in his recliner, picked up the remote, and changed the channel without asking. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye. His jaw was tight, his eyes were distant. She opened her mouth to ask if something was wrong, but before she could speak, he turned up the volume on the television. The conversation, it seemed, was not welcome. She told herself it was nothing. Everyone had difficult days. Everyone carried invisible weight. Harold had always been a man of few words, and Margaret had learned over the years not to press him when he retreated into silence. He would come around eventually. He always did. So she turned back to the television, adjusted the blanket on her lap, and let the moment pass like a small cloud drifting across an otherwise clear sky. She did not know then that it was the first of many clouds. She did not know that the sky was slowly beginning to darken. A few days later, it happened again. Margaret had dropped a spool of thread while knitting in the living room. It rolled beneath the coffee table, just out of her reach. She called out to Harold, who was reading in the next room. "Honey, could you help me? I dropped my thread." There was a pause, longer than usual, and then his voice came back, flat and tired. "Can't you get it yourself?" Margaret blinked. She looked down at her wheelchair, at the narrow gap beneath the table, at her arms that could not stretch far enough without risking a fall. She wanted to say, "No, Harold, I can't." But something in his tone stopped her. Something cold, something unfamiliar. She didn't ask again. Instead, she leaned forward as far as she dared, gripping the armrest of her chair with one hand while reaching beneath the table with the other. Her shoulder ached. Her fingers brushed the edge of the spool but couldn't quite grasp it. After a long minute of struggle, she finally managed to pull it toward her, her breath shallow, her heart heavier than it should have been over something so small. When she sat up again, Harold was standing in the doorway, watching her. He said nothing. He did not apologize. He simply turned and walked back to his chair, leaving her alone with the silence and the strange, sinking feeling in her chest. That night, Margaret lay awake for hours. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Harold's steady breathing beside her, and tried to understand what had changed. Had she done something wrong? Had she said something to upset him? She replayed the past few weeks in her mind, searching for a moment, a word, a gesture that might explain his sudden distance. But she found nothing. Everything had been the same as always, the routines, the meals, the quiet evenings. And yet, something beneath the surface had shifted. She could feel it the way one feels a storm approaching before the clouds even appear. The air had changed. The warmth had dimmed. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that 40 years of marriage meant something, that love did not simply vanish overnight, that devotion did not disappear without warning. Harold was just tired. He was getting older. They both were. Perhaps the weight of caregiving had finally begun to press down on him in ways he could not express. Perhaps he simply needed rest, patience, understanding. Margaret decided she would give him all three. She would not complain. She would not question. She would be the wife she had always been, grateful, quiet, accommodating. But deep inside, a small voice whispered a warning. It told her that something was wrong. It told her that the man lying beside her was not the same man who had once held her hand in hospital waiting rooms, who had once whispered, "You're not a burden." It told her that silence could be a wall, and distance could be a weapon, and love, even the strongest love, could be slowly poisoned by resentment. Margaret heard that voice. She felt its truth in her bones, but she pushed it away. She buried it beneath years of trust and hope and the desperate need to believe that everything would be okay. She would not confront the disturbance. Not yet. Not now. She would wait. She would watch. She would hope. And in doing so, she would give the darkness time to grow. The silence grew louder with each passing day. Margaret began to notice it in the mornings, the absence of small kindnesses that had once defined their life together. The coffee mug no longer waited for her on the table. The radio no longer played gospel hymns when she wheeled herself into the kitchen. Harold would be sitting in his chair, staring out the window or scrolling through his phone as though she had not entered the room at all. She would say, "Good morning," and he would nod without looking up. She would ask how he slept, and he would shrug. The words between them became fewer, thinner, until some mornings passed with no words at all. At first, Margaret made excuses for him. She told herself he was tired. She told herself the years of caregiving had worn him down in ways she could not fully understand. She reminded herself of all the sacrifices he had made, the ramps, the grab bars, the endless adjustments to their home and their life. Perhaps he had simply given too much. Perhaps he had nothing left. She wanted to believe that his coldness was temporary, that the man she had married still existed somewhere beneath the surface. But as the weeks passed, that belief became harder and harder to hold on to. The cruelty came in small doses. One afternoon, Margaret asked Harold to help her reach a bowl from the upper cabinet. He stood slowly, walked to the kitchen, and pulled the bowl down without a word. But as he handed it to her, he let go too soon. The bowl slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, pieces of ceramic scattering across the tile like broken teeth. Margaret gasped and looked up at him, expecting concern, expecting an apology. But Harold simply stared at the mess and said, "That's the third thing you've broken this month." His voice was flat, His eyes were empty. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the shards and the sting of his words. She cleaned it up herself. It took her nearly 20 minutes. She had to wheel herself to the hallway closet, retrieve the broom and dustpan, and maneuver carefully around the broken pieces without cutting her hands. By the time she finished, her arms ached and her chest felt tight. But worse than the physical strain was the weight of something she could not name, a heaviness that had begun to settle over her spirit like dust on forgotten furniture. She did not cry. She had taught herself long ago not to cry over things she could not change. But that night, as she lay in bed, she felt something crack inside her, something small, something important. The insults came next. They were never shouted. Harold was not a man who raised his voice, but his words carried a sharpness that cut deeper than any scream. "You're slower than you used to be," he said one evening as she struggled to transfer from her chair to the couch. "I don't know why I bother," he muttered when she asked him to adjust the thermostat. And once, only once, but Margaret would never forget it, he looked at her across the dinner table and said, "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't stayed." He said it quietly, almost to himself, as though she were not even there, as though she were invisible. Margaret stopped asking for help. She learned to manage on her own, even when it hurt. She learned to reach for things she shouldn't reach for, to strain muscles that shouldn't be strained, to push her body past its limits just to avoid the sighs, the eye rolls, the cruel remarks. She ate smaller meals so there would be fewer dishes. She stayed in her room longer so she wouldn't be in his way. She made herself as small as possible, hoping that if she took up less space, he might remember how to love her again. But the opposite happened. The less she asked, the more he resented her presence. He began to leave the house for hours without telling her where he was going. He stopped answering her questions. He stopped looking at her altogether. One evening, Margaret wheeled herself into the living room and found him sitting in the dark, the television off, his hands folded in his lap. She asked if he was okay. He didn't answer. She asked again, softer this time. And then, without turning his head, he said, "I'm tired of this life. I'm tired of you." The words landed like a fist to her chest. Margaret did not respond. She could not. She simply turned her chair around and wheeled herself back to the bedroom, closing the door behind her with trembling hands. She sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the silence of the house, feeling the walls close in around her. She thought about calling someone, her daughter, a neighbor, anyone. But what would she say? That her husband was tired? That he had stopped loving her? That she was afraid of a man who had never raised a hand against her, but had somehow made her feel more alone than she had ever felt in her life? She said nothing. She told no one. And the injustice continued to rise. It happened on a morning Margaret was never supposed to be alone. Harold had left early that day, earlier than usual, muttering something about a doctor's appointment across town. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't tell her when he'd be back. He simply grabbed his keys from the hook by the door and walked out, leaving behind the faint smell of aftershave and the heavy silence that had become their constant companion. Margaret sat in the kitchen for a long while after he left, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the empty chair across from her. The house felt different without him in it, quieter, lonelier. And yet, for the first time in weeks, she also felt something else, a strange, cautious sense of relief. She decided to clean. It was something to do, something to keep her hands busy and her mind quiet. She started in the living room, dusting the shelves she could reach, straightening the magazines on the coffee table. Then she moved to the hallway, wiping down the picture frames that lined the walls. Old photographs of their wedding, their children, their grandchildren. She paused at one image, A photo of her and Harold taken 20 years ago, standing on the porch of this very house, smiling into the camera like two people who had figured out the secret to happiness. Margaret touched the glass gently. She barely recognized the woman in that photograph. She barely recognized the man. She didn't plan to go into Harold's study. The room had always been his space, a small office at the end of the hallway where he paid bills, read the newspaper, and kept the documents that governed their shared life. Margaret rarely entered it. There had never been a reason to. But that morning, as she wheeled past the half-open door, something caught her eye. A drawer in his desk had been left slightly ajar, and inside she could see the edge of a manila folder stuffed with papers. It was probably nothing. It was probably tax returns or old receipts. But something in her chest tightened. Something told her to look. She pushed the door open and wheeled herself inside. The room smelled of old paper and dust. Sunlight streamed through the small window, casting a pale rectangle of light across the wooden floor. Margaret approached the desk slowly, her heart beating faster than it should have. She reached for the drawer and pulled it open. Inside were stacks of documents, envelopes, letters, statements, arranged in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though Harold had been organizing them recently. She pulled out the first folder and opened it in her lap. What she found made her blood run cold. There were bank statements showing withdrawals she had never authorized, credit card bills with balances she had never seen, a letter from a financial advisor she had never heard of, discussing something called a second mortgage. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned page after page, each one revealing another piece of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Harold had been borrowing money, large sums of it, against the house they had owned together for nearly 40 years. He had signed her name on documents she had never seen. He had made decisions about their finances without telling her a single word. But that was not the worst of it. Near the bottom of the stack, Margaret found another envelope. This one thicker, heavier, sealed with a red logo she didn't recognize. She opened it carefully, her fingers shaking, and pulled out a collection of forms printed on official-looking paper. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. But when the words finally registered, her entire body went still. It was a life insurance policy. In her name, recently increased. Worth more than she could have imagined. Margaret stared at the document for a long time. She read the numbers again and again, hoping she had misunderstood, hoping there was some innocent explanation. But the truth was, right there in black and white, undeniable and terrifying. Harold had taken out a policy on her life, a policy that would pay him a substantial sum if she were to die. And he had done it recently, in the past 6 months. Around the same time he had started pulling away. Around the same time his sighs had turned to silence, and his silence had turned to cruelty. A cold wave of fear washed over her. She thought about all the things that had happened in recent weeks, the dropped bowl, the nights alone, the way he looked at her sometimes as though she were already gone. She thought about the isolation, the way he had slowly cut her off from friends, from family, from anyone who might notice that something was wrong. She thought about how easy it would be for an accident to happen to a woman in a wheelchair, a fall, a forgotten medication, a locked door. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret feared her husband, not his words, not his coldness, but him, the man she had trusted with her life, the man who now, it seemed, might be planning to take it. She placed the documents back in the drawer exactly as she had found them, and she said nothing when Harold came home that night. The argument came without warning. It was a Thursday evening, and the sky outside had turned a deep shade of violet as the sun sank behind the tree line. Margaret was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent 3 days carrying the weight of what she had found in Harold's study. 3 days of silence. 3 days of watching him move through the house like a stranger, wondering if he could see the fear in her eyes, wondering if he knew that she knew. She had told herself to stay calm, to wait, to think. But that evening, something inside her broke. She couldn't hold it in any longer. She asked him about the papers. Her voice was quiet, steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Harold," she said, "I found the documents in your desk, the mortgage, the insurance policy." She paused, searching his face for something. Guilt, shame, explanation. But his expression didn't change. He simply stood by the counter, his back half turned, his jaw tight. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too thin. And then, slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were cold. "You went through my things," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Margaret felt her stomach drop, but she held her ground. "I had a right to know," she replied, her voice trembling now. "That's our house, Harold, our money, our life. You signed my name without telling me. You took out a policy on my life." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to say the words she had been afraid to speak aloud. "What are you planning to do?" Harold's face twisted into something she didn't recognize. He stepped toward her, his voice rising. "What am I planning? I've spent 12 years taking care of you. 12 years of lifting you, feeding you, cleaning up after you. And this is the thanks I get? Accusations? Suspicion?" His words came faster now, sharper, like glass shattering against stone. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed, no idea what it's like to wake up every single day knowing that my life stopped the moment yours did." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but he wasn't finished. He moved closer, his shadow falling over her. "You're a burden, Margaret. You always have been." The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs, felt her hands grip the armrests of her wheelchair as though she might fall. She wanted to scream at him, to defend herself, to remind him of the woman she had been before the accident, the wife she had tried to be after it. But before she could speak, Harold grabbed the handles of her chair. For a moment, she didn't understand what was happening. Then he began to push, hard, fast, toward the back door. She cried out, but he didn't stop. He shoved the screen door open with his shoulder and pushed her onto the porch. The evening air was cool against her skin, the gravel driveway just beyond the ramp glowing faintly in the dying light. And then, with a strength she hadn't known he possessed, Harold grabbed the wheelchair from beneath her and yanked it away. Margaret fell. Her body hit the cold kitchen tile as the chair was ripped from under her, and she heard it, the horrible, hollow crash of metal against stone as Harold hurled it into the driveway. She couldn't move. She lay on the floor, her cheek pressed against the tile, her legs twisted awkwardly beneath her. The screen door slammed shut. She heard Harold's footsteps retreating into the house, heard the bedroom door close with a heavy thud. And then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that fills a room after something irreversible has happened. The kind of silence that tells you everything has changed. Margaret did not cry at first. She simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, her breath shallow, her body trembling. The light above her flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the walls. She thought about her mother, who had survived so much and still found the strength to smile. She thought about her daughter, Ellen, whom she hadn't spoken to in months. She thought about the woman she used to be, the woman who danced at church picnics, who laughed easily, who believed in love without fear. That woman felt so far away now. And then the tears came. They spilled from her eyes without sound, sliding down her temples and pooling in the hollow of her neck. She did not sob. She did not wail. She simply let the grief pour out of her in silence, mourning not just the marriage she had lost, but the life she had believed in, the life she had trusted, the life that had, in the span of a single evening, crumbled into dust around her. She had never felt more alone. The wheelchair lay somewhere in the darkness outside. Her medication was on the counter, out of reach. Her phone was in the bedroom, behind a closed door she could not open. She had nothing. She was nothing. Just a woman on a cold floor, abandoned by the man who had promised to love her forever. This was her lowest moment. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small flame flickered. Not hope, not yet. But something quieter, something waiting. For a long time, Margaret did not move. She lay on the cold tile floor, her body aching, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of everything that had just happened. The house was silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of crickets outside. The light above her had stopped flickering, settling into a dim, steady glow that cast pale shadows across the ceiling. She could hear Harold in the bedroom, the creak of the mattress, the rustle of blankets. And she knew he had gone to sleep. As though nothing had happened, as though she were not lying helpless on the floor just 30 feet away. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw her mother's face. Clara Mae Johnson had been a woman of uncommon strength, a sharecropper's daughter who had raised 5 children on her own after her husband left, who had worked double shifts at the textile mill just to keep food on the table, who had smiled through every hardship as though joy were a choice she made each morning before sunrise. Margaret remembered sitting on her mother's lap as a child, listening to her hum hymns while the sun set over the cotton fields. She remembered her mother's voice, soft but unwavering, saying, "Baby girl, life will knock you down, but you don't stay down. You hear me? You never stay down." Margaret opened her eyes. The ceiling looked the same. The floor felt just as cold. But something inside her had shifted, a small, quiet movement, like the first crack of dawn breaking through a long and heavy night. She thought about everything Harold had said. She thought about the cruelty, the betrayal, the documents hidden in his desk. She thought about the wheelchair lying somewhere in the driveway, abandoned and broken, just like he wanted her to be. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she did not feel sadness. She felt resolve. It rose slowly, like a tide creeping up a shore. It did not crash or roar. It simply filled her, steady, silent, unstoppable. She was not going to die on this floor. She was not going to let Harold win. She was not going to disappear quietly into the darkness like a woman who had already given up. She had survived a car accident that should have killed her. She had rebuilt her life from a hospital bed. She had learned to live without legs, without independence, without the freedom most people took for granted. And if she could survive all of that, she could survive this too. Margaret began to move. It was slow at first, painful. She pressed her palms flat against the tile and pushed herself up onto her elbows, her arms trembling with the effort. Her lower body was useless, dead weight dragging behind her, but she did not stop. She pulled herself forward, inch by inch, using the edge of the counter to guide her. Her shoulders burned, her fingers scraped against the floor, but she kept going. She had to keep going. The phone was in the living room. She had left it on the side table that morning, plugged into the charger, its screen dark and silent. If she could reach it, she could call someone. She could call for help. She did not know who yet. Her mind was too focused on the task at hand to think that far ahead. All she knew was that she needed that phone. It was her lifeline, her only way out. It took her nearly 45 minutes. By the time she reached the living room, her arms were shaking so badly she could barely lift them. Sweat dampened her forehead. Her nightgown was torn at the hem from dragging across the floor. But she made it. She reached up, grabbed the edge of the side table, and pulled the phone down into her lap. The screen lit up, casting a soft blue glow across her face. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. And then she dialed a number she hadn't called in months. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Margaret held her breath, praying silently, hoping desperately. And then, A voice, tired, confused, but unmistakably familiar. "Mom?" Ellen's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with sleep. "Mom, is that you? It's almost midnight. What's wrong?" Margaret closed her eyes. She did not cry. She did not break. She simply held the phone to her ear and said the only words that mattered. 5 words, quiet and steady. The beginning of everything that would come next. "I need you to come." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, uncertain silence. And then Ellen's voice returned, sharper now, more alert. "Mom, what happened? Are you okay? Talk to me." Margaret looked toward the darkened hallway, toward the bedroom where Harold slept peacefully, unaware that the woman he had tried to destroy was already beginning to fight back. She took a slow breath. She steadied her voice, and she said, "I'll explain everything when you get here. But please, Ellen, come quickly, and don't come alone." The turning point had arrived, not with thunder, not with fury, but with a single phone call made from the floor of a dark and silent house. And nothing would ever be the same again. 2 days passed in heavy silence. Margaret did not speak to Harold. She did not confront him. She did not let him see anything in her face that might suggest what she had set in motion. When he woke the next morning and found her back in her wheelchair, retrieved by a neighbor who had seen it lying in the driveway and knocked on the door with concern, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, and walked past her into the kitchen. Margaret watched him go, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. She had made her decision. Now all she had to do was wait. Ellen had promised to come. She had listened in silence as Margaret told her everything: the cruelty, the documents, the insurance policy, the wheelchair thrown into the gravel like garbage. There had been a long pause on the other end of the line when Margaret finished speaking. And then Ellen's voice had returned, low and fierce, carrying a fire Margaret had not heard in years. "Don't do anything," Ellen had said. "Don't say anything. I'm coming, Mom, and I'm bringing help." Margaret didn't ask what kind of help. She simply trusted her daughter for the first time in a long time. Their relationship had been strained for years. Arguments over choices, distances that grew too wide to cross, silence that stretched into months. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Ellen had believed her. What mattered was that Ellen was coming. And what mattered was that Margaret was no longer alone. The days moved slowly, like honey dripping from a spoon. Margaret went through the motions of her routine: coffee in the morning, television in the afternoon, quiet meals at the kitchen table where Harold sat across from her without speaking. She watched him carefully now, noticing things she had missed before. The way his eyes darted toward the study door when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he checked his phone constantly, his jaw tightening with each message. The way he avoided her gaze, as though he could sense that something had changed but couldn't quite name it. He was nervous. Margaret could see it in the stiffness of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the air between them, a shift, a tension, a quiet electricity that hadn't been there before. But he didn't ask. He didn't confront her. He simply watched and waited, just as she did, 2 people circling each other in the silence of a house that had become a battlefield. On the morning of the 3rd day, Margaret woke early. The sky outside was pale gray, the kind of soft, heavy light that comes before rain. She dressed herself slowly, choosing a simple blue blouse and a cardigan she hadn't worn in months. She brushed her hair. She put on the small gold earrings her mother had given her decades ago. She wanted to look like herself, not the broken woman Harold had tried to create, but the woman she had always been beneath the surface, strong, dignified, unafraid. She was sitting by the window when she heard the car. It pulled into the driveway just after 9 o'clock. A dark sedan with tinted windows, unfamiliar and deliberate. Margaret's heart beat faster, but she did not move. She simply watched as the doors opened and Ellen stepped out, her face set with determination, her posture straight and unwavering. Behind her came a man in a gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase. And behind him a second vehicle, white, official-looking, from which emerged a woman with a clipboard and a county deputy in full uniform. Harold appeared in the doorway. Margaret heard his footsteps stop abruptly, heard the sharp intake of his breath as he took in the scene before him. She turned her chair slowly to face him. His face had gone pale. His hands hung limp at his sides. He looked at the people in the driveway, then at Margaret, then back again, as though trying to understand how his carefully constructed world had suddenly begun to crumble. No one spoke. The air was thick with tension, heavy as the clouds gathering overhead. Ellen walked up the porch steps first, her eyes meeting her mother's through the screen door. There was no smile, no greeting, only a look that said everything words could not. "I'm here. I believe you. This ends now." The lawyer followed behind her, his footsteps slow and measured. The social worker and the deputy waited near their vehicles, watching, ready. Margaret wheeled herself toward the door. She pushed it open with trembling hands, letting the cool morning air wash over her face. She looked at Harold one last time. This man she had loved, this man she had trusted, this man who had tried to erase her from her own life. And then she looked at her daughter, at the people who had come to stand beside her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt powerful. The reckoning had arrived, and Harold had nowhere left to run. The kitchen table had never felt so small. Margaret sat at one end, her hands resting on the worn surface she had wiped clean 1,000 times before. Ellen stood beside her, one hand placed gently on her mother's shoulder. Across from them sat Harold, his face ashen, his eyes darting between the lawyer and the deputy, who stood near the doorway, like sentinels guarding the only exit. The social worker had taken a seat near the window, her clipboard balanced on her knee, her pen poised and ready. No one had raised their voice. No one had made any sudden movements. And yet the room hummed with a tension so thick it was almost impossible to breathe. The lawyer spoke first. His name was David Whitmore, a man Ellen had found through a colleague, someone who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases. He was calm, methodical, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that demanded attention without ever rising above a conversational tone. He opened his briefcase and removed a thick manila folder, placing it on the table between them. "Mr. Miller," he began, "I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain the documents we've recovered from your desk. I suggest you take that opportunity seriously." Harold said nothing. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled against the edge of the table. But he did not speak. He simply stared at the folder as though it were a snake, coiled and ready to strike. David Whitmore opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch and deepen before he continued. One by one, he laid the papers out in a row: bank statements, mortgage agreements, forged signatures, and finally the life insurance policy that had made Margaret's blood run cold. "These documents show a pattern of financial fraud," the lawyer said. His voice remained steady, almost gentle, but his words landed like hammer blows. "You took out a second mortgage on this property without your wife's knowledge or consent. You forged her signature on multiple occasions, and you increased a life insurance policy in her name, a policy that would pay you nearly $400,000 in the event of her death." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle over the room. "Would you like to explain why?" Harold's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Margaret, his eyes searching her face for something. Sympathy, perhaps, or forgiveness. But Margaret's expression did not waver. She held his gaze without flinching, without trembling, without looking away. She had spent 40 years softening herself for this man. She had spent 12 years depending on him. And she had spent the last several months being slowly destroyed by him. She was done softening. She was done depending. She was done. "I didn't," Harold began, his voice cracking. "Don't," Ellen interrupted. Her voice was sharp, edged with a fury she had been holding back since she arrived. "Don't you dare sit there and lie. Not after what you did to her. Not after what I saw in that driveway." She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "A neighbor saw you throw her wheelchair into the gravel. She gave a statement. It's already been filed." Harold's face crumbled. The mask he had worn for so long, the dutiful husband, the silent martyr, began to slip. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled. He looked suddenly older, smaller, like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You don't know what it's been like. The bills, the pressure. I was drowning. I didn't know what else to do. So you decided to destroy her instead." Ellen's words cut through the room like a blade. The deputy shifted near the door, his hand resting lightly on his belt. The social worker scribbled something on her clipboard. And Margaret? Margaret simply watched. She watched the man she had once loved unravel before her eyes. She watched his excuses fall flat against the evidence laid out on the table. She watched him search for a way out and find none. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room with a power that silenced everyone else. "I gave you 40 years, Harold." She paused, letting the words settle. "I gave you my trust, my love, my life. And when I needed you most, when I was at my weakest, you tried to erase me." She shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "I used to wonder what I did wrong. I used to lie awake at night, asking myself why you changed. But now I understand. You didn't change, Harold. You just stopped pretending." Harold stared at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. His lips parted as though he wanted to respond, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been laid bare, not just the documents, not just the fraud, but the deeper truth beneath it all. He had failed her. He had betrayed her. And now, finally, he would be held accountable. The deputy stepped forward. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you're going to need to come with us. There are questions that need to be answered down at the station." Harold rose slowly, his legs unsteady, his face pale as paper. He did not resist. He did not argue. He simply walked toward the door, pausing only once to look back at Margaret. She did not look away. She held his gaze until he disappeared through the doorway, until the sound of his footsteps faded into the morning air, until the screen door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. And then, only then, did Margaret allow herself to breathe. Margaret left the house on a Sunday morning. The sky was clear and pale blue, the kind of gentle autumn day that felt like a blessing after a long storm. Ellen had packed her mother's belongings the night before: clothes, photographs, the small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother, and the old Bible with the cracked leather spine that Margaret had kept on her nightstand for 40 years. There wasn't much else she wanted to take. The furniture, the dishes, the decorations on the walls, they all belonged to a life she no longer recognized, a life she was ready to leave behind. Ellen helped her into the car. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her wheelchair folded and stored in the trunk, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She looked at the house one last time, the porch where she had once sat with Harold on summer evenings, the window where the dogwood tree bloomed every spring, the driveway where her wheelchair had lain broken and discarded in the gravel. She expected to feel sadness. She expected to feel grief for the life she was losing. But as Ellen started the engine and pulled slowly away from the curb, Margaret felt something else entirely. She felt free. The drive to Ellen's house took just under 2 hours. They didn't talk much along the way. There would be time for conversation later, Time for healing. Time for all the words that had gone unspoken for too many years. For now, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the radio playing softly, the road stretching out before them like a promise. Margaret watched the countryside pass by outside her window, fields of golden wheat, farmhouses with white fences, children playing in front yards. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was part of the world again. Ellen's home was small but warm. It was a 2-bedroom cottage on a quiet street, lined with oak trees, their leaves just beginning to turn shades of red and orange. There were flower boxes beneath the windows and a wooden swing on the front porch. When Ellen opened the door and wheeled her mother inside, Margaret saw that the guest room had already been prepared. The bed was made with fresh linens. A vase of yellow daisies sat on the nightstand. And on the dresser, in a simple silver frame, was a photograph Margaret hadn't seen in years, a picture of her and Ellen taken at a family reunion, both of them laughing, their arms wrapped around each other. Margaret touched the frame gently. "I found it in a box last year," Ellen said softly, standing in the doorway. "I meant to send it to you. I just never did." Her voice wavered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ellen crossed the room, knelt beside her mother's chair, and took her hands. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I let so much time go by. I should have called. I should have visited. I should have—" Margaret shook her head. "You're here now," she said quietly. "That's all that matters." She reached up and touched her daughter's face, brushing away a tear that had begun to fall. "We can't go back, sweetheart, but we can go forward, together." The days that followed were slow and gentle. Margaret spent her mornings on the front porch, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the sun rise over the oak trees. Ellen brought her coffee each day in a new mug, pale yellow with a small painted bird on the side. They ate breakfast together, talked about small things, laughed at old memories they had nearly forgotten. In the afternoons, Margaret would read or knit while Ellen worked in the garden. In the evenings, they watched old movies on the couch, sometimes holding hands without saying a word. The legal process moved forward. Harold was charged with financial fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The neighbor's testimony, combined with the documents Margaret had found, painted a picture that could not be ignored. He did not contest the charges. He did not fight. According to Ellen, who attended the hearings on her mother's behalf, he looked like a man who had already given up, hollow, broken, emptied of whatever darkness had driven him to do what he did. Margaret did not attend. She did not need to see him again. That chapter of her life was closed. The house was sold within 3 months. Margaret signed the papers from Ellen's kitchen table, her hand steady, her heart at peace. The money would be enough to ensure her care for the rest of her days. But more than that, more than any dollar amount, was the knowledge that she had reclaimed her dignity. She had refused to be erased. She had refused to disappear. One morning, not long after the sale was finalized, Margaret woke before dawn. She wheeled herself to the window and watched the sky shift from black to violet to gold. The birds were singing outside, their voices light and clear. The air smelled of coffee and fresh rain. And as the first rays of sunlight touched her face, Margaret smiled, not because the past had been easy, but because the future, finally, was hers. Margaret's story did not end with the courtroom. It did not end with the sale of the house, or the signing of papers, or the closing of a chapter that had nearly destroyed her. Her story continued, quietly, gently, in the small moments that followed, in the warmth of her daughter's kitchen, in the laughter shared over Sunday dinners, in the peace of autumn mornings spent watching the sky turn gold through lace curtains. She had survived. She had endured. And now, finally, she was learning what it meant to live again. But her journey leaves us with a question. A question that lingers long after the final scene fades. A question that each of us, in our own way, must someday answer. How well do we truly know the people we love? And what do we do when the ones we trust the most become the ones who hurt us the deepest? Margaret trusted Harold with her life. She gave him 40 years of devotion. She gave him her faith, her vulnerability, her future. She believed, as so many of us believe, that love, once spoken, remains unchanged. That vows, once made, cannot be broken. That the person who stands beside us in our darkest hour will never become the source of our darkness. But life, as Margaret learned, does not always follow the path we expect. People change, circumstances shift, and sometimes the hand that once held ours becomes the hand that pushes us away. This is not a story about hatred. It is not a story about villains and victims, about good and evil drawn in simple lines. Harold was not born cruel. He was not always the man who threw a wheelchair into the gravel and walked away without looking back. Once he had been kind. Once he had been patient. Once he had loved Margaret in the way she deserved to be loved. But somewhere along the way, under the weight of years, under the pressure of sacrifice, under the slow erosion of his own unspoken pain, he lost himself. He allowed resentment to take root where compassion once lived. He allowed silence to replace honesty. And in doing so, he became someone Margaret no longer recognized. This does not excuse what he did. Nothing excuses cruelty. Nothing excuses betrayal. Nothing excuses the deliberate dismantling of another person's dignity. But perhaps in understanding how such things happen, we can learn to prevent them in our own lives, in our own homes, in our own hearts. Perhaps we can learn to speak before silence becomes a wall, to ask for help before burden becomes bitterness, to love not just in the easy moments, but in the difficult ones, when patience runs thin, when exhaustion sets in, when the weight of caregiving feels too heavy to bear. Margaret's strength was not loud. She did not shout. She did not fight with fists or fury. Her strength was quiet, the kind that lives deep beneath the surface, waiting to be called upon when everything else has fallen away. It was the strength to pull herself across a cold kitchen floor, the strength to reach for a phone in the darkness, the strength to say 5 simple words to a daughter she hadn't spoken to in months. "I need you to come." That is the kind of strength that saves lives. Not the strength of muscles or weapons, but the strength of spirit, the strength to rise, even when rising seems impossible. And that is the moral of this story. Strength is not about standing. It is not about walking. It is not about the body we live in or the limitations the world places upon us. Strength is about choosing, every single day, to believe that we are worthy of dignity, of safety, of love. It is about refusing to be erased, even when someone we trusted tries to make us invisible. It is about reaching out, even when we are afraid. It is about trusting that somewhere, someone will answer. Margaret found her strength on the floor of her own kitchen. She found it in the memory of her mother's voice. She found it in the sound of her daughter answering the phone at midnight. She found it in the quiet decision to fight, not with anger, but with truth. And in doing so, she reclaimed the life that had nearly been stolen from her. She proved that no matter how far we fall, we can always find a way to rise. So now, friends, the question comes to you. What would you do if you found yourself in Margaret's place? What would you do if the person you trusted most became the person you feared? Would you have the courage to reach for help? Would you have the strength to speak the truth? Would you find, somewhere deep inside, yourself, the quiet flame that refuses to be extinguished? Think about it. Think about the people in your life who may be suffering in silence. Think about the ones who smile but never speak. Think about the ones who have stopped asking for help. Not because they don't need it, but because they've been made to feel like a burden. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is simply notice, simply ask, simply be there. Margaret's story is over, but yours is still being written. What would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments.